Ani Bojo Ginawea, Nigonzit Indishnakas, Misquadisi Nidodem, Gichiwikwadong and Donjiba, Anishinaabe Kwe, meanwhile, Sakadoi Kwe and Dao. Hi, everyone. My English name is Megan, and I am the Executive Director of the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS Strategy. I am very excited to be here with three brilliant First Nations colleagues who have been doing HIV activism and advocacy work for decades. We're really excited to have a conversation today to look at where we've been, where we are, and where we're going as part of Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week. So with that, I will turn it over to each of my colleagues to introduce themselves in a way that they're comfortable with. Let's start with you, Trevor.
Thank you, Megan. I am Trevor Stratton. I am a citizen of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Our traditional territory is Toronto, calling in from a hotel room in Calgary. Megan, as you know, I've been living with HIV for 32 years now, and I've been working in the movement, in the HIV response since about 1999, volunteering and getting involved. I work with communities, alliances, and networks, also called CAN. You might remember they used to be called the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. I'm their Indigenous Leadership Policy Manager. So thanks for inviting me to the show.
Thanks, Trevor. And let's go over to you, Doris.
Ani Bojo. Kwenda exit Nishnikas, Wawash Gesh Dodem. Nishnabe Kwenda, we Kwem Kung Donjaba. I just shared my spirit name to the ancestors so that they know that it's me. And my English name is Doris, and I'm a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. And when this webinar goes live, I will be 66 years old. I've been living with HIV for 22 years, almost 22 years. Wow, time just sure flies. I'm from Wikwemkong on Manitoulin Island, and I got involved in activism probably within months of my AIDS diagnosis. I was diagnosed at the AIDS stage, and I thought that was something very unique to just me. But when I went into the movement, I quickly found out that it was not unique to just me, that it was happening to a lot of women. My sisters, my Indigenous sisters, were testing late at the AIDS stage. And so that's when I kind of kicked in as an activist. Miigwech, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Megan.
Miigwech, Doris. We're really glad that you're here with us today. And let's go over to Renee.
Good morning, everyone. Gishaba, Gijik, Indigenous, Mangdodem. That was my spirit name, which is the Horizon, which interestingly enough, on my way here this morning, there was a beautiful sunrise that I got to witness. So I really appreciate being able to be with you here today to really talk about this important day and week that's coming up. I also, my English name is Renee, and I belong to the Loon clan, and I come from Laxio First Nation, which is in Grand Council Treaty 3 territory. And I'm currently working here in Thunder Bay. So thanks for putting this together, Megan, and welcome, Doris and Trevor.
I'm so happy that we're all here together, and we thought we would start the conversation today taking a look back at where we've come from. And so we thought we'd start by asking, what motivated you to become an HIV activist? Why don't we start with Renee?
So for me, next month I'll be living with HIV for 30 years. And I can remember when I first tested positive, how afraid I was of it. And I met a young man who was living with AIDS and spent a lot of time with him in those early days, learning about HIV and some of the challenges that he had in his life. And before he passed away, he brought me into his hospital room and said to me that he saw me as having a warrior spirit, and that AIDS was not going to get me, that I was going to die an old man. And I said, "You're crazy," because this was at a time when there were just treatments that were being tried out, and lots of us were guinea pigs at the time. And so I said, "You're crazy for saying." He said, "No," he said, "I see a warrior spirit, and you're going to go and make a difference in the Indigenous communities, talking about HIV." And he said, "What happened to me is not going to happen to you." So, I really made a commitment to him that day, that I was going to go out and learn as much as I could about HIV, and eventually travel back home to my own territory and start doing this education. So that really got me involved, or lit a fire under me, and got that flame started. And that's why, still to this day, I'm very much involved in activism when it comes to HIV issues for Indigenous people living with HIV.
Miigwech, Renee. And let's go over to you, Doris. What motivated you to become an activist?
What motivated me to become an activist was I was seeking information about what kind of supports were out there for somebody like me as an HIV positive Indigenous woman that had tested late at the AIDS stage. And so that journey began. And really for me, it was a journey of listening and collecting information, and maybe reframing that information for myself in terms of what was out there, and getting a lay of the land, and realizing that there was no services for somebody like me as an HIV positive Indigenous woman. And there was very little research as well on about HIV positive Indigenous women. And most of the services were designed for men. And I wanted to make a difference in terms of bringing awareness about HIV positive women, Indigenous women. And so I began this kind of knowledge tour. And I became involved at the regional level first. And then I became involved when Trevor invited me and told me about CAN, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. And I ended up at a national conference there. Probably because I was new to the movement, my scholarship got accepted immediately. Or maybe Trevor put in a good word for me, I don't know, but I made it to that table. And I didn't know anybody when I arrived there, but I do remember the two people that came and sat with me when I arrived. You know how it is when you arrive at a conference and you don't know anybody, and you go sit at a table by yourself, you see everybody knowing each other. Two people came and asked if they could sit with me, and they introduced themselves. One of them was an HIV positive woman, and the other one was a board member of CAN. And that was my introduction to the national level. It was nice.
Thanks for sharing. And Trevor, what motivated you to become an activist?
Well, I remember, going to, we're going far back now here into historical records. I remember being in Toronto as a teenager and in my early 20s and discovering the gay village. And I remember how terrifying it was at that time when HIV started to run through our gay communities and our gay men. It wasn't always just gay men. I mean, there were always women getting HIV and trans people, but the focus was on gay men, and it was called a gay disease. And you'd see it in the gay village, you'd see men pushing their boyfriends all thin with purple spots all over them. And I'd be in the bar and people would come up to me and say, Trevor, I have a lesion on my brain, and that's the last time I ever saw my party friend, my beer buddy, and I should have given a trigger warning, but in gay pride, you'd see these heroes, these activists that were held up very high, and we'd be cheering and crying, and they'd be gone, and just a couple, a few months later, our heroes, these activists. And then I got HIV. And I remember getting counseling at the time and thinking, I'm not worthy. I saw on the news how people in Africa, they're getting nothing, they're dying, And then I started getting sick in the mid 90s. So diagnosis in 1990. And then, in the mid 90s, I started getting really quite sick. And they came up, in 1996, they came up with the new antiretrovirals. And I got up off my deathbed and started walking around. I felt feeling healthy and going back into the clinic again and being offered the medications a couple of years later. I didn't want to take them because I felt privileged, and I knew millions of people in Africa and Asia and around the world had no access, and they had no hope, and they were going to die. And I refused to take the treatment because of guilt. And counseling helped me to take my meds, but I will never forget. There's still
That was your
40
Lazarus moment.
Yeah. And I want to give back because CAN helped me. Two-Spirited People, the First Nations helped me. OHAS helped me. And I want to continue giving back, but I get a lot out of it too. I'm not just giving. So it's extremely rewarding. And our work is not really about our voices. It's about elevating the voices of the people that can't be at that table. The people that aren't privileged. I am privileged, and that's why I got medications and I can maintain an undetectable viral load. I'm still motivated that way, Megan.
Miigwech, Trevor. Yes, we're so lucky that we have so many years of experience here in this call, and I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts are of where we've been and where we are today and where we're going. So the next question that we have here, when I first joined OHAS in 2020, I was new to the sector, I was new to this work, and I was interested in learning more about where did Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week come from. So I'll go to you, Trevor, and I'll ask, what is the history of World AIDS Day and Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week? Why is this so important for us to be acknowledging and celebrating and remembering all of our loved ones, friends, family, not only in December, but that's when this time is. So can you tell us more about this history?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know exactly who was the very first one that came up with World AIDS Day, but I know that the United Nations, especially UN AIDS, embraced it and promoted it worldwide. But in Canada, Indigenous peoples, our voices weren't really heard at World AIDS Day. It was and our Indigenous people living with HIV or at risk, we didn't identify with this World AIDS Day. We didn't feel like it was our venue. And that's why communities, alliances, and networks came up with Aboriginal AIDS Awareness Day. So that's how it came up, so that people would see that if this is an Aboriginal issue, we need to own this and do something about it because it's in our communities, and we need to lead this response in our own communities and our own peoples. So it was so successful, and we're talking about the late 90s and early 2000s here. So they were so successful, they expanded it to Aboriginal AIDS Awareness Week. And it became, there were, activities all across Canada. When CAN would partner with different membership organizations or research, anybody who wanted to partner and put these things on. And, as Aboriginal fell out of favor as the word to describe our peoples, and we started using the word Indigenous, it became Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week. And now it's become a lot larger than CAN. It's really become something that we all embrace. And people, organizations and communities have their own events without even contacting CAN a lot of times. They just, because it's become so well known, everybody just does it. So now it's become almost an institution in itself. It's a time to celebrate our successes, but it's also a time to remember our relatives who passed on.
When I got involved at CAN and became employed there, I remember when it actually expanded to become a week. And it started out small, like it started out with maybe up to 4 other sites were having events. And then I think the whole concept was, let's ignite those home fires across the country. And during this week, so one day these fires will go on in these communities. The next day there's other fires being ignited in other communities, and let's let that happen for a whole week. And I remember when it started, it was maybe 2 events a day, but now it's like multiple events that are happening. I'm involved in this one and 2 other ones as well. So
Thanks
thought
so
I'd
much.
mention that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doris. And we're happy that you took the time to be here with us today. I know you're very busy. All 3 of you are, so it's amazing that we have you here and to come together. Let's go back to you, Trevor. And can you remind us of what have been some of the historical milestones in the movement that you want to talk about?
Well, I'm going to talk from the Indigenous perspective, instead of the whole movement overall, because I think that's really important to talk about how back in 1990, Two-Spirited People of the First Nations in Toronto was the very first Indigenous AIDS service organization in Canada. And that began, there's a lot that led up to it. They originally wanted to call themselves Gays and Lesbians of the First Nations. When they were meeting at the 519 Community Center, 519 Church Street Community Center in Toronto, and having meetings talking about, we need to do something about the HIV response, but it was also a Two-Spirit movement. So the Two-Spirit movement and the Indigenous HIV response were very much together. And they grew up together, and they're separate and different, but it's important distinction to realize that Two-Spirit people were very, very involved very early on. I don't mean just the organization, but individuals, our citizens that are Two-Spirit. And Two-Spirits incorporated in 1990, and then they realized that they could probably do work all across Ontario, but they didn't want to label it as Two-Spirit provincially. So they formed a working group called the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS Strategy. And that working group spread across Ontario under my dear mentor, the late Laverne Monette. And 10 years later, I find myself as the chair of the working group, or the steering committee for OHAS. I was the president of Two-Spirited People of First Nations on the board. And in 2005, OHAS, as you know, Megan, OHAS incorporated, and I was the very first president on the board of OHAS back then. And I need to also talk about the formation of CAN. The Canadian AIDS Society, CAS or CAS, was in the late 80s, was making space for Indigenous people to talk about HIV. And during those meetings, they, not me, realized that they needed a national Indigenous organization. And originally they were going to call it the National APHA Network, the National Network of Aboriginal people living with HIV and AIDS. And it's struggled to get going until the realization came, we need the whole family, everybody need, all our relatives, all the researchers and the academics and the organizational leadership, they all needed to be on board for this to be successful. So in 1997, CAN, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, was formed. And since then, they've been doing a lot of work. They started doing research. They started doing harm reduction. They've come a long way to the point where they've expanded, like many AIDS service organizations, into sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections. They also do TB. They do mental health and aging as it relates to all those issues. And they formally changed their name a couple of years ago to Communities, Alliances, and Networks. So that's my piece.
Language, Trevor. And Renee, are there some historical milestones that you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, so in Ontario, there were a group of educators who had come together and eventually formed a group called the Ontario First Nations HIV/AIDS Education Circle. But early on, it was two educators, one that was from Anishinaabe Nation and another from Grand Council Treaty 3, who were looking at the education around HIV, and it wasn't really a great fit for the communities because the communities just weren't fully understanding how they were doing the education. And so he developed a tool called the HIV Teaching Turtle. And from that tool, he really talked about HIV in a holistic and circular fashion. And it really resonated with communities. And the young people especially were understanding the importance of why this message was important. And so they eventually got together with other educators from different provincial, territorial organizations and decided to form an education group that would help them share resources that were being developed so that they would have more of I'm trying to think of the word, a cohesive list of facts that were coming out. And so they really worked on trying to build on that. And now they're called the Ontario First Nations HIV/AIDS Education Circle, and they do a lot of activism, including talking about World AIDS Day and Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week.
They cover the First Nations communities, right? So
Yeah.
they're funded by the federal government through to bring education and awareness to First Nations communities. So they work within that jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, and that in itself is important when we're talking about things like World AIDS Day and Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week, because the importance of the activism around that, the importance of understanding those jurisdictional barriers that are caused, those perceived borders that don't necessarily exist for Indigenous people, but the government structures it in a way and it creates challenges for people living with HIV and people trying to access care. It creates challenges with that, and so it's really important to understand the differences in the work that OHAS, Two Spirits, and CAN does, and the work that the Ontario First Nations HIV/AIDS Education Circle does. It's really trying to work in partnership and address some of those barriers for people living with HIV.
Great, thank you. And thanks for helping us unpack that a bit more, Doris. I think also one of the things that is important is to recognize those accomplishments that we've had. And I want to really raise my hands to Doris and acknowledge her for the PhD, the honorary PhD that she received for all of her lifelong work in this area. And I know
Well
that we are
deserved.
humble people, but I think it's important to acknowledge that. And in that line, I also wanted to ask each one of you, are there things that you are proud of, thinking about your journey in HIV activism? What are those things that you're proud of? Doris, let's start with you.
Okay, well, thank you for telling everybody about the honorary doctorate that I received. I don't necessarily go around and talk about it to anybody very much or hardly at all. It was really really about acknowledging my contributions to Indigenous health research, why I was awarded that distinction. And so I'm going to go to, you know, something I'm really proud of. It's really about having that persistent voice in the movement and being very vocal in the movement about, you know, that we needed to focus on women like myself that are living with HIV and include women in the movement, create spaces for them to have dialogue with each other and come up with their own solutions to the lack of you know, services that are tailored for women, Indigenous women living with HIV, because there was no spaces like that. And so I was very persistent, and out of my persistence, there was a women's committee that was formed, that was reinvigorated at CAN, called the Voices of Women. And we worked together, and these women came from different parts of the country, across the country. And one of our first tasks was to really kind of formulate a women's strategy, you know, to respond to HIV and AIDS that was impacting Indigenous women at the time. At the time, around that time, the rates of HIV test reports were really high. Women were overrepresented in the HIV surveillance reports. And I also recall at one point that it was about a 65% prevalence rate that was connected to injection drug use. And so it was quite alarming, the statistics that were coming out about, you know, the impacts of HIV and women. And so we continued doing our work, and with the VOW committee, I facilitated their engagement, and they also wanted to have standing committee status instead of being an ad hoc committee. So Laverne Monette actually helped us to write a resolution that was presented and unanimously passed at CAN that recognized VOW as a standing committee. A standing committee means it's a permanent committee, and within the organization, and a permanent committee of the board. And so that was through persistence and through real passionate and driven advocacy that happened. And then we got involved in research, because there was very little research about HIV positive Indigenous women at that time. And maybe there were 3 projects that had been done. And one of them was a project about the families. And so we really pushed for research, and now I'm really proud to say that we have a huge amount of Indigenous women's research happening across the country. So you know, those of us that were involved at that time, we really lit that fire for that to happen. And we also pushed for, you know, the way Western research is done, it was consistently pathologizing Indigenous people. And, you know, by always unpacking our deficits and presenting us as people in need of help. And we started to push back on that as women. And we said there's more to the story than just our trauma. Let's focus on our strengths to balance this out. And then the strengths-based methods started to be implemented into research. And there was I believe there's been a paradigm shift in terms of how we do community-based research now. Every community-based research project now introduces strengths-based methods into their research designs. And I really believe we women had a role in that. And I was the consistent voice always raising that and pushing back against the pathologizing of Indigenous people. So I'm really proud of that.
As you should be. There's lots of achievements in what you've just shared, and I know there's still a long way to go for greater equity, but there's lots to celebrate in the work that you have done and your colleagues have done. So thank you for sharing that. Trevor, are there pieces that you want to share with us today around your journey in activism movement?
Well, actually, the pieces that I'm most proud of are the work that we've done together as the three amigos, Renee, Doris, and I. No, seriously, like, for example, the caucus of Indigenous people living with HIV hosted by CAN. That was an incredibly powerful experience. Doris and I were co-facilitators and liaisons for Indigenous people living with HIV. And every year, sometimes even twice a year, we'd have a 1 or 2 day meeting of Indigenous people living with HIV. And we would ask them, what do you want? We would ask them, choose your leaders. Let's have an election to have representation on the board. We would have orientation when they came in. We would have ceremony, giveaway ceremonies. And we would make new friends and meet relatives that we haven't met before, like cousins and sisters and aunties. And it became, you know, CAN, the network part of CAN, the last word, networks. We really were a network of people with lived experience. And that was very powerful. And Renee, you were part of that too. I believe you were a co-chair of the caucus for a while, which meant you were a board member as well. And we together, it was just so powerful. When there's something magical that happens when Indigenous people living with HIV come together to talk about the issue. It's safe. There's no stigma around HIV. It's gone. It's one of the only places where we can go. It's this bubble. And then we'd leave and go home again, but our batteries would be charged so we could do the good fight back at home and advocate for people living with HIV. So that's the one thing. The other thing is some of the graphic facilitation that I learned from Renee, and you know, doing these consultations and making this big map on the wall that's very artsy, very art, and lots of cool things. And they're telling us what kind of symbols and what kinds of things they want to see. And we look at what we want to do in 2 years. I don't want to get too far into it, but that's another magical experience where we all did this together. And we had these 4 years in a row, we had these First Nations APHA summits. And it was run and led by and for Indigenous peoples. And I really have to thank the Ontario First Nations HIV/AIDS Education Circle for allowing us to do that and giving us that space. That is that's not often where we're allowed to have our own space and we run with it. You know, we have the football, we're going for the touchdown. It felt good.
We organized.
And you know, people still talk about that, and I still remember when you were talking about the caucus. I think it was in Sault Ste. Marie, where the circle provided us a space to go to a room and come up with a wish list. And I just remembered Trevor on his computer just tapping away at our wish list. And, you know, it took us a few years to keep on pushing to get that funding, but eventually we did get the funding to have that gatherings, and people still talk about it to this day. So I think that's something, if I was going to mention what I'm proud of, would definitely have to be that, for sure.
Oh, yeah, and through those summits too, leading up to the summits, we should also be proud about the Chiefs of Ontario passing a resolution unanimously, what we call the JIPA resolution, the Greater Involvement of Indigenous People Living with HIV resolution.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, and that was exciting when we found out it was a unanimous resolution that was passed. It was awesome, and I got to be there to witness that. That was awesome.
Chimi Gwetch for sharing. There's so many things to celebrate and so many achievements that have happened. And it's certainly a testament to all of the work and activism that the three of you have done. And also a good reminder for us today to continue carrying that work forward. You can certainly see the imprint that the three of you have left in the sector. It's still with us today, and we still have a lot of commitments that we need to move forward on. So thinking about that and bringing us to where we are today, Renee, maybe I'll go over to you. What is the current landscape of where we are today?
So I think we have a lot of challenges, and I think for me anyways, being a service user for so many years, and now I'm on the service provider end of things, it's really highlighted for me that we still have a lot of work to do. And I think one of the biggest challenges is ensuring that the education around prevention of HIV is getting out to who it needs to get out to. And we need to talk about the new tools we have available to us, because back in the old days, we were just talking about condoms and new needles, harm reduction, those kind of things. But now we have things like PrEP, PEP, U equals U, those kind of things. We really need to emphasize the importance of having that conversation. That HIV is still a real thing. Sometimes I'm told by people, if I bring it up, oh, they'll ask me, is HIV still a thing? And I was like, well, of course. I said, there's still no cure for it, and it can be a serious challenge for people to live with HIV, especially when it comes to things around addressing stigma. But yeah, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the future, and I'm optimistic that we're going to get there, and pass that torch on to the next generation. We've always talked about that, Doris, Trevor, and I, about passing that torch on to somebody, and we do have some real great young people coming up that are really go-getters.
Thanks, Renee. And maybe I'll go over to you, Doris. I know we've talked a little, Renee mentioned a few things about stigma, but thinking about where we are today, do you have thoughts on, have things changed when it comes to HIV stigma?
Well, yes and no. I say yes, things have changed because the stigma has lessened a little bit in some arenas, but in other places it has not shifted at all. And I think part of the problem is people are not educated about it. And maybe there's an unwillingness to talk about HIV as well. And because our leadership has so many priorities as well, HIV might be priority number 25 in a list of priorities that our leadership have. And I think there's a colonial piece too here that kind of feeds into this. And that's the unwillingness to talk about sex and sexuality. You know, that was kind of ingrained in our people through the residential school system, you know, despite the fact that that was a place where there was a lot of sexual abuse happening. And they don't want us to talk about it. And so there's an unwillingness to talk about it. And I think we have to talk about it. I unpacked that word one time that I heard when I went back home to my community. People were whispering about me because I went home when I was diagnosed with AIDS and at the AIDS stage, and I had AIDS, and I went home, and people were whispering about me in the community, and they were saying, "We not pne." And that word really hurt. And it was maybe about 2 years ago, I was speaking to my sister who's very proficient in the Indigenous language. And I asked her, tell me what this means, if it actually is a stigmatic word, and where did it come from? And I thought maybe it came from the smallpox blankets or something, and she says, it's not a stigmatic word. And she broke down the word. She says, it's about the science. It's our Indigenous science. What it actually acknowledges is it's acknowledging that there's a body that's come in, another entity, or not entity, but another body that's entered your body. And it's about that science of that other body that's come into your body. That's all it is, she said. And because we think with Western minds all the time, we've adopted that Western thinking and translate that word to dirty disease or bad disease, but it isn't what it means. So we have to take a deep dive into our Indigenous languages to really understand some of the science when we talk about these things as well.
Chimik Watch for sharing that. And I think it's also important for us to look at where we're going, and you were starting to mention that, in how we can destigmatize language by going back to understanding, you know, Anishinaabe, Moin, and other Indigenous languages. And so I'm wondering, you know, where do you see things going in the future, Doris?
Well, I'm a bit of a geek. I am a scientific geek. That's probably why I'm involved in research. I'm involved in community-based research. Some people call me community-based researcher, and I go, oh, okay, that's who I am. So I'm very interested in scientific research as well. And I think that came at the beginning of testing positive as well, because I wanted to learn about all these treatments that were available. I read everything on each of the treatments that I was on. I think most of us did that, but not everybody does that. But I think it's really important. I encourage people to read up on the treatments that they're on. So recently at the international conference here in Montreal at AIDS 2022, they started talking about injectables. We all know that there's an injectable that's out there right now, Cabenuva, I think it's called. And you get injected every 2 months for that. So you don't have to take your treatment every day and suffer those side effects. You go in for your shot every 2 months. But now the scientists are amazing that are doing the HIV research. They're looking at an injectable now where you would get 1 shot a year. Imagine that, eh? Wow. And there's a lot of hope in that. And they're also talking about, yeah, we hear about U equals U, but now the scientists are talking about HIV remission. It's almost a normalizing of HIV in a way. It's similar to when cancer goes into remission. So science has come a long way, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Language. And I think picking up on that theme of hope and optimism, when you're thinking about the future, Trevor, are there things that get you feeling hopeful or optimistic?
Well, I agree with Doris about the new technologies that are coming out. Now we have self-testing kits. We can get kits mailed to our house and test ourselves for HIV and connect through different online or different phone numbers to get support and connect to care and treatment. That gives me hope. There's something called multiplex testing, where you don't just test for HIV, you can test for HIV, hepatitis C, tuberculosis, and maybe, diabetes will be added. And so that science is being developed too. We have something called PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis, which means you take a pill every day and it prevents you from getting HIV. If you know that maybe you're sexually active, and maybe I have multiple partners, it's very important. It's a very important tool. Another thing that they're testing out now is called the Good Health Box, which is a vending machine that gives out harm reduction supplies like new needles and even condoms and things like that. You answer a survey on the machine, and then if you qualify, then it just drops out for free for you. But all these technologies are great, but like others have said, political will is incredibly important, and the willingness of our communities to walk with these different technologies and integrate them in an Indigenous way, our Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, into our communities, because Indigenous people are part of the solution. We're not just saying, come and help us, oh, poor us. And I keep saying this, Indigenous people have a hell of a lot to offer this world, and not just around HIV. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and Indigenous ways of knowing and doing can help.
Miigwech for sharing that powerful message. And Renee, thinking about the future, are there things that, get you excited or optimistic or feeling hopeful?
Yeah, well, when I think about that, I think, I reflect back on where we came from and the work that was being done way back in the early days. And I've always said, even back then, and I'll say it again today, that the answers to these questions lie within our First Nation communities, with our Indigenous people. We have those answers. It's just a matter of educating ourselves and recognizing that the answer's been there all along. And I think with all of these wonderful tools that are coming out, it's a matter of, like Trevor was saying, having that political will of our leaders to be able to implement some of these things and support those tools and moving forward. So yeah, the answers are within our communities, our history. We've overcome a lot of things, and I think we've been here for a long time, and we're going to continue to be here for a long time.
Miigwech. And since we're talking about the future, I think it's also important to think about how young people are a part of the work that's happening, and you've mentioned some of that already. And I'm just wondering if, I'll come to each of you, but I'm just wondering if you have a message for young people. Doris, let's start with you.
Our future is in good hands. I can retire knowing that our future is in good hands with the amazing young people that are involved in the response and the innovation of their work that they're doing. We're in good hands.
Miigwech. Trevor, do you have a message?
I would say, don't give up, keep going. You're doing great. We love you. Whether you're Inuit, Métis, First Nations, I often hear that youth are the leaders of tomorrow. You are the leaders right now. You are leaders and we need you. Thank you.
Miigwech. And Renee, do you have a message?
I would just echo what Doris and Trevor have said, and just to tell young people that your story matters. And I think, that's the way we approached doing this work, was using our own stories and getting the permission of others to share the real life experiences that we had in our journeys of living with HIV. And young people today, your stories do matter, and they are going to be a part of that, answering those questions. Miigwech.
Miigwech, and miigwech to all of you for sharing your time and energy with us all today.
Miigwech.
Thanks for doing this,
Miigwech.
Megan. You're
Yes,
great, and
thank
you
you.
know we love you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
we love
Megan.
you.
You're awesome.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Hey!